guys, welcome to another Exploration Saturday, and today we have critters on the trail and we're going to talk about animal tracks. So with Lewis and Clark, a lot of their men, most of their men, knew how to track animals because there's no grocery stores out in the Louisiana Territory at this time in the early 1800s, so you needed hunters to track for animals and to hunt for food. And the men ate quite a bit of meat. In the journals, there's one day where they eat 9 pounds of meat each, because that's where a lot of their calories are coming from. That's where their energy is coming from, is the food they eat. And because they have quite a bit of work to do every day, either rowing the keelboat or loading, unloading cargo, or taking observations about their surroundings, these men needed a lot of energy. And so you always had to go hunting every day. If you ever read through the journals, there's always someone hunting, always someone out and about. And so when Lewis and Clark recruited their soldiers to help them, they made sure these men could hunt and that they're really frontiersmen. So if you were an accountant or maybe an artist, you might not have got selected. But if you were maybe someone from the frontier who knew how to hunt and track animals, you were definitely probably recruited for the expedition. Now, there's a lot of different animals you might see in Siouxland today, the Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota area. We know from the journals that the captains and their men saw quite a few different animals, some that you still see today. I'll read off a list. You might recognize some of these animals. They saw deer, elk, geese, turkeys, duck, pelican, beavers, badgers, gray wolves, coyotes, prairie dogs, a lot of mosquitoes. They saw a bull snake, and they saw evidence of bison, buffalo. They didn't see them, but they saw tracks. Now, you might have recognized some of these, and some you might not have. For example, animals like the gray wolf and the elk. We really don't have too many around nowadays because they've kind of lost their habitat where they make their home. Because there's so many people living here today, we've kind of built cities and towns, and we kind of took over where they used to live. And so we don't see too many of those animals anymore. But with Lewis and Clark, they saw a whole bunch of these different animals. And every day when the hunters went out to go hunting, they looked for signs from these animals, their tracks. So for example, if you were a hunter, things you would look for in the ground, maybe in the snow, the mud, the dirt, you would look for little impressions that the animals left with their foot. And then when you would find them, you would look for different characteristics to help you figure out what that animal was. First, you might look at the size, how big is this track? Is it a big animal, small animal? You would also look at, which way are the toes pointing, because that will tell you which direction your animal is going. You look at how many toes it has. If it has 4 toes, it might be a coyote. You look for claw marks. Are there any claws? You will look for the stride. So let's say you have maybe a wolf or a bobcat walking around. The stride is you would measure from their top left foot all the way down to their next top left foot, and that would give you the stride. So how long their legs are, how long their feet are. And so it kind of gives you a good idea, is this a big animal walking around? You could also, look at the straddle. So that would be from their left foot to their right foot. How wide are they apart? Because if it has a pretty wide straddle, you're probably looking at a pretty big animal. We know like grizzly bears, they're pretty big and they kind of waddle back and forth when they walk. So you can kind of see, that wide straddle. And if it kind of, waddles, this track looks like, it's a little zigzag waddle. You might be looking at a bear. And so some of these animals, like a grizzly bear, I have a track right here from a grizzly bears. The hunters would kind of recognize the signs. They didn't see any bears here in Siouxland, but once they got more north, they saw a whole bunch of bears. They definitely saw grizzly bears too. And now grizzly bears are pretty big animals. their claws can be 2 to 4 inches. I have a ruler here, so their claws, if you found one with 4-inch claws, would go right about there on your ruler. Their back foot could be 11 inches in length, so that's about 11 inches, almost a whole ruler. And so these are pretty big animals. They do have 5 toes, and usually when they're walking, you can see signs of their claws mark too in the mud. So the hunters knew if they had a really big track and there's 5 toes with some claw marks in the mud, they could be looking at a bear. Now they could also be looking at maybe a coyote, maybe a bobcat. And the really good way to tell the difference between, if you're looking at a bobcat or a coyote, a cat or a dog, is if there's claw marks. If there's claw marks, you're probably looking at some kind of dog, like a coyote or a fox, because a cat actually retracts its claws. The claws doesn't show up in its print. So this guy has claw marks, so he's probably a coyote. We know he has 4 toes up here. We see little 4 toes. Coyotes, they have kind of smaller feet. They are about 3 inches in length, so let's see here. So their track marks go to about 3 inches. That's about the size of their little paws. But you can look for those 4 toes, you look for the claw marks, and you might see a coyote. Also around this area, we see a lot of deer, and deer are really cool. They have 2 toes. You see these 2 big toes. These little dots are called dew claws, and they don't always appear in the mud in their tracks. So you're looking for these 2 big toes. They're kind of pointed at the top, and they kind of have a heart shape to them. And so deer, their claws or their prints are about 3 inches too, so they're about that size. Now, similar to a deer, but way bigger, are bison. And bison are really similar to the deer, but they're rounder, they're bigger, they're not as pointed at the top, and they kind of curve, so they're really round and circular. And with the bison, they can be about 4 to 6 inches. So let's see here, 6 inches is right about there. So if you see a pretty big mark like this, you're probably looking at a full-grown bison. And you can still see some bison around the area, not as much, but if you do see a track like this, it's probably a cow nowadays. So there's a lot of fun different tracks from animals that you might see in your neighborhood. And a really fun way to preserve the track is to make a cast of it using Paris plaster. Now, right now we don't have a lot of snow, and it's not really good snow for taking a cast of all those animal prints you might see. So we have a really fun way that you can make your own animal tracks and make a cast of it so you can keep it for a long time. All you need is some Paris plaster, which you can find in really any home department store, some water, mixing bowl, measuring cup, and then you just need some old Play-Doh. Everybody usually has Play-Doh lying around if you're like me. You're going to gather all your supplies together, and then all you need to do is go to the store and find some animal stamps. And I found these really big ones online, and we're going to make an imprint in our Play-Doh. We're going to fill it with some plaster, let it dry, and then I'll show you the finished project when I have some done here. So you're going to just take your Play-Doh, you're going to make it a little rounded up into a ball, squish it out for your stamp. Then I have a plate here. I'm going to squish down my Play-Doh. I'm going to take my paw stamp, I'm going to push it into my Play-Doh so it leaves a track in the Play-Doh. There we go. And you don't have to use big stamps. You can use smaller stamps you might have lying around. Or you happen to be living somewhere that has really nice, kind of that snowman type snow on the ground, or maybe you have some mud and you see some animal tracks. You can use that for your imprint. But today I'm going to use Play-Doh. So I made an imprint of a bear paw on my Play-Doh. Next, I'm going to whip up some plaster to pour into my print. And you're going to use a 2-to-1 ratio, which means basically 2 scoops of plaster, 1 scoop of water, depending how much you're making. I'm using a 1/2 cup measuring spoon. So I'm gonna do a full cup of plaster, so 2 scoops of plaster. And then I'm only gonna do 1 scoop of water, so 2-to-1 ratio. I'm gonna pour that into my mixing bowl, and then you're gonna stir it together. And you're kind of looking for a pancake consistency, so not too thick, but not too wet. So you can add a little bit more water or plaster if you need to. And you kind of stir it together so there's no lumps. Now, if you do find a track outside in the mud or snow, you don't have to use Play-Doh. You go ahead, head outside with your plaster, mix it up, and then you pour it right into that print. But it's also really fun to make it with Play-Doh too, in case you don't have the right kind of snow or mud. Once it's all mixed up, we're gonna pour it into our print here. You kind of start on the outside, let it pour into the middle of the track there. There we go. And you can do quite a few different tracks with this plaster if you're using like a cup of plaster and a 1/2 cup of water. And then I kind of just like to tap it on the table so all the air bubbles get out of the clay there, or out of the plaster. And then we just have to let it sit for about 2 to 3 hours until the plaster dries. Doesn't really take too long, just let it sit for a few hours. And then it's gonna cook kind of like this. So you have my plaster that's all nice and dry. I did this about 3 hours ago. You can see the Play-Doh at the back of it. And then you very carefully are gonna peel away the Play-Doh from your track. Now the plaster can be a little fragile, so start on the outside of the track, around the edges, and we're gonna slightly pull away. And I think actually I might have cracked my plaster, but that's okay. I have a backup one. So I'm gonna carefully, very gently around the edges, start peeling it away from the plaster. And it's okay if it cracks like mine did. The good thing about tracks is that you can always make more. And I'm gonna gently peel it off. And then you can always cut off some of that extra plaster around the sides. But I have a duck track here. So I have a little duck that must have been walking around the center today. And these will be really fun to keep, you know, maybe as a garden decoration this spring. I have like a finished bear one. The Play-Doh, if you use color Play-Doh, will kind of leave some color mixed in with the plaster. You can even color it with color pencils too if you want to. You can color right there on the plaster. Just gotta remember to be a little gentle, otherwise the plaster might crack, but you can always make more. So feel free to ask questions or share your pictures of your animal tracks in the comments below. And we will see you next Saturday. Thanks, guys.